Who authorized you to touch that machine?
Nobody, sir.
My engineers told me this machine was dead.
They were looking in the wrong place.
Then tell me what you found.
At exactly 4:07 in the morning, the most expensive machine inside Brennan Aerospace suddenly came back to life. For 3 days, 12 experienced engineers had tried to restart it. They had checked the electrical systems. They had run diagnostics. They had followed the manufacturer's troubleshooting procedure. And they had reached the same conclusion. The machine was dead. A $94,000 replacement control board was already on order. Production was falling behind. And a $300 million aerospace contract was beginning to hang in the balance. But now, beneath the harsh white lights of an almost empty factory, the machine was running again. Standing beside it was a 19-year-old black intern with oil covering his hands. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have an engineering degree. He wasn't authorized to touch the machine. And according to the chief engineer who had humiliated him only hours earlier, he wasn't qualified to diagnose it either. Then footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. Avery Fletcher turned. A silver-haired man was walking toward him. He looked at the machine, then at Avery, then back at the machine. Finally, he asked the question Avery had been hoping nobody would ever ask.
Who authorized you to touch that machine?
Avery swallowed.
Nobody, sir.
The man's expression hardened. My engineers told me this machine was dead. Avery lowered his eyes toward the oil-stained notebook in his hands. They were looking in the wrong place. The man took another step forward. Then tell me what you found. Avery opened the notebook. And when the billionaire saw what was written on page 48, he realized the problem inside his factory wasn't just a broken machine. Something else had gone wrong. Something much harder to repair. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos from Story Vault. Because the question isn't simply how a 19-year-old intern fixed a $2 million machine. The real question is this: how did 12 experienced engineers miss what Avery Fletcher saw? 3 days earlier, nobody at Brennan Aerospace was asking that question. Because 3 days earlier, almost nobody knew Avery's name. Avery Fletcher was 19 years old. His identification badge didn't say engineer. It didn't say technician. It didn't say apprentice. It said intern, general support. And at Brennan Aerospace, that put him near the bottom of the organizational chart. His days were rarely exciting. He sorted replacement parts, moved tools, delivered paperwork, organized shelves, tracked down missing supplies, carried boxes from one production area to another. If something needed to be done, and nobody important wanted to do it, there was a good chance Avery would be asked to do it. He didn't complain. He understood that he was starting at the bottom. But what most people didn't know was that Avery had spent years preparing for something much bigger. He just hadn't been given the opportunity yet. Avery was taking community college classes and saving money for his education. But his real education had started much earlier. It had started in his grandfather's garage, and it had started with one simple rule: listen before you touch anything. His grandfather, Earl Fletcher, had spent years working with machines. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have a wall covered in university degrees. He didn't own a sophisticated laboratory. But Earl understood machines in a way Avery had always found fascinating. He could listen to an engine and recognize a problem. He could place his hand against a generator and feel a vibration that other people couldn't detect. And whenever Avery wanted to immediately replace a part, Earl would stop him. Listen first. Then he'd ask, what do you feel? And finally, verify. Listen, feel, verify. Those 3 words became the foundation of Avery's education. They also became the reason he carried a small black notebook everywhere he went. The notebook was old. Its corners were bent. The cover was scratched. Some pages were covered with numbers. Others contained diagrams, measurements, observations, questions, and notes from machines Avery had studied. It wasn't a school notebook. It was a record of everything he didn't want to forget. Earl had given it to him years earlier. Your memory won't always remember, he'd said. Your notebook will. Avery believed him, so he kept writing. Every sound, every vibration, every strange measurement, every mistake, every lesson. He had no idea that one of those pages would eventually save Brennan Aerospace nearly $94,000, and possibly much more. Brennan Aerospace was not an ordinary company. Its factory was enormous. There were secured production areas, restricted work zones, computer-controlled equipment, specialized tools, and machines worth millions of dollars. The employees working there had spent years earning their positions. Some had master's degrees, some had decades of manufacturing experience. Others had worked on aerospace equipment where a tiny mechanical error could bring an entire production process to a halt. Avery respected them. He watched them. He listened to them. And whenever someone explained something he didn't understand, he wrote it down. That was how he learned. Quietly, without asking for attention. Until one afternoon, something happened that made one of Brennan Aerospace's most respected engineers notice him. His name was Craig Lawson. Craig was 50 years old. He was the chief engineer. He had more than 2 decades of experience and a reputation for solving difficult technical problems quickly. People respected Craig, but they also knew something else. Craig had very little patience for people he considered inexperienced. And to Craig, Avery was very inexperienced. One afternoon, Craig was walking past a workstation when he heard Avery speak. "Excuse me." Craig stopped. A technician was entering calibration information into a diagnostic system. Avery was standing nearby. He pointed toward the screen. "I think that number is different from the procedure." The technician frowned. Craig walked closer. "What number?" Avery pointed again. The technician checked the printed procedure, then the screen. He froze. Avery was right. The wrong calibration value had been entered. It was corrected before the mistake created a larger problem. Craig looked at Avery. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "Good catch." Avery nodded. "Thank you, sir," and returned to work. It seemed insignificant, but Craig remembered it, because sometimes being noticed isn't always a good thing. 2 days later, a 5-axis CNC machine stopped working. The machine was worth approximately $2 million, and its failure immediately became a serious problem. The machine was connected to a production line supporting a major aerospace contract worth roughly $300 million. Every hour it remained down increased the pressure. Every missed production target created another problem. Managers started making calls. Schedules were rearranged, production teams were told to prepare for delays, and 12 engineers were brought in to determine what had happened. The machine's control screen displayed one message: E4421, axis position fault. The engineers checked the obvious possibilities. They inspected wiring, reviewed diagnostic reports, tested electrical systems, examined components, followed the manufacturer's troubleshooting procedure. But the machine refused to cooperate. Every restart ended the same way, the same error, the same shutdown, the same silence. Eventually, the engineers began narrowing down the possibilities, and their attention turned toward the control board. By the 3rd day, the conclusion appeared obvious. The control board was probably failing. A replacement was ordered. The cost? $94,000. The delivery time? Weeks. That was the moment Avery became uncomfortable. Not because he thought he knew more than the engineers. He didn't. But because he had been watching the machine, and something didn't make sense. The system was reporting a position fault, yet some of the diagnostic information still appeared normal. If the control board was failing, why was it still successfully processing certain information? Avery didn't have the authority to ask. So he watched and waited. That afternoon, Craig gathered the engineering team around the machine. Avery was nearby organizing tools. He wasn't part of the meeting. Craig explained that the evidence pointed toward the control board. "We've checked everything else," he said. Someone asked how long the replacement would take. Weeks. Another engineer asked about the cost. $94,000. The conversation became tense. People started discussing production schedules, possible workarounds, alternative facilities. Avery kept working, but his eyes remained on the machine. There was something wrong with the diagnosis. Not necessarily the machine, the diagnosis. Finally, Avery made a mistake. He spoke. "Sir, I don't think the control board is the problem. The room went silent. Craig slowly turned. What did you say? Avery repeated himself. I don't think the control board is the problem. Craig stared at him. And what makes you think that? Avery explained what he had noticed. The machine wasn't behaving like a completely failed control board. Some information was still reaching the system. The error seemed to be happening because the system was receiving something it didn't expect. Avery wasn't claiming he had solved the problem. He was simply saying the diagnosis might be pointing in the wrong direction. Craig's expression hardened. You're an intern. Yes, sir. You sort parts. Yes, sir. You don't diagnose million-dollar machines. Avery lowered his eyes. I understand. Craig stepped closer. If you want to learn engineering, go to school. If you want to work here, do the job you're assigned to do. Nobody said anything. Avery nodded. He turned away, but Craig wasn't finished. His eyes landed on Avery's notebook. What is that? Avery hesitated. My notes. Craig picked it up. He opened it. Pages of handwritten diagrams, measurements, machine sketches, questions, observations. Craig flipped through several pages, then dropped the notebook onto the edge of the machine. It landed in a shallow pool of oil. Oil spread across the pages. Avery stared at it. Craig looked at him. Your hands are only good for holding a broom. Nobody laughed. Avery slowly picked up the notebook. He closed it and walked away. He didn't argue. He didn't insult Craig. He didn't tell anyone what he was thinking. He simply disappeared into a small maintenance room and began wiping the oil from the pages. Some of the ink had blurred. Some diagrams were damaged. But one page had survived, page 48. And that page contained the 3 words Avery had learned from his grandfather. Listen, feel, verify. That night, the factory slowly emptied. One employee after another left. The production floor became quieter. The overhead lights remained on. Ventilation systems hummed. Machines in distant sections occasionally started and stopped. And at the center of the building sat the silent $2 million CNC machine. Avery stood behind a glass window looking at it. He knew he should go home. He knew Craig had made the rules clear. He knew touching the machine without permission could cost him his internship. But something kept bothering him. He didn't think the engineers were stupid. He didn't think he was smarter than them. He simply thought they might be looking at the wrong thing. Avery opened page 48. Then he remembered Earl. Don't start with what the machine says is wrong. Start with what the machine is actually doing. Avery looked toward the production floor. Then he walked back to the machine. He didn't start by replacing anything. He listened. He checked the control panel, then the indicators, then the available diagnostic information. Nothing immediately proved that the control board had failed. That didn't mean the board was good, but it meant something else might be happening. Avery moved around the machine. He placed his hand against the housing. Nothing. He moved his hand. Still nothing. Then he waited. A faint vibration passed through the metal. Avery froze. He moved his hand back. There it was again. Tiny, almost invisible, but real. He waited. Then he heard it. Tick, pause. Tick, pause. Tick. The rhythm wasn't perfectly regular. Avery followed the sound. It led him toward an area near the encoder assembly. That was important, because the encoder helped the machine determine where an axis actually was. If the encoder reported the wrong position, the control system could believe the machine had moved incorrectly. And if the system couldn't trust the position data, it could shut the machine down for safety. Avery opened the cover. Nothing looked obviously broken. No burned component. No destroyed wire. No dramatic failure. For a moment, he wondered whether he had imagined the vibration. Then he saw it. The mounting bracket. It was slightly out of position. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough to catch someone's attention during a quick inspection, but enough to matter. Avery grabbed a dial indicator. He positioned it, measured, reset it, measured again, then again. The number was outside the expected specification. Avery stared at the instrument. He checked it one more time. Same result. The encoder wasn't necessarily broken. The control board wasn't necessarily broken. The problem could be the alignment. But why had the bracket moved? Then Avery noticed something near the base of the machine. Scuff marks. Fresh-looking scuff marks. He crouched closer. He remembered seeing a forklift operating in that area earlier in the week. He couldn't prove the forklift had caused the damage, but the possibility was suddenly there. A small impact, a shifted bracket, a misaligned encoder, incorrect position data, a position fault, a safety shutdown. Avery stared at the machine. For the first time, the entire chain made sense. The engineers had followed the error code. Avery had followed the symptom. But there was still one problem. Finding the cause didn't mean he could fix it. Avery checked the company's inventory system. No replacement bracket. He searched nearby components. Nothing suitable. He checked the manufacturer's information. Ordering the correct part would take time, possibly too much time. The $94,000 control board was already weeks away. A replacement bracket wouldn't solve the immediate problem either. Avery stood beside the machine. He could close the panel, go home, report his findings in the morning. Let the engineers decide. That would be the safe choice. Then he looked at the production schedule. He thought about the engineers. He thought about Craig. And then he remembered Earl. Slow hands make good work. Avery walked toward the salvage area. The salvage area contained equipment that had been removed from service. Old fixtures, metal housings, unused components, discarded parts. Avery wasn't looking for the exact bracket. He was looking for material, something precise enough to create a temporary shim. Eventually, he found a piece of aluminum. He measured it. Too thick. He tried another piece. Not suitable. He returned to the first. It could work, but only if he could remove enough material without ruining it. Avery carried it to the workbench. He found a file, then a micrometer. He began. Scrape. Measure. Scrape. Measure. The factory was almost silent. His hands began to ache. The first measurement was nowhere near where it needed to be. He kept going. Scrape. Measure. Scrape. Measure. A small cut appeared on one finger. He wrapped it with tape, then continued. He remembered Earl's voice. Never rush because somebody else is watching. Avery smiled faintly. He kept working. The aluminum became thinner. He measured again. Closer. Still wrong. Again. Closer. Again. Finally, the micrometer showed 0.0030 inches. Avery stared at the number, then measured it again. And again. The result remained consistent. He had the shim. Now came the dangerous part. Avery returned to the machine. He positioned the shim beneath the mounting bracket. Then began the alignment process. He checked the dial indicator. Adjusted. Checked again. Adjusted slightly. Checked again. The measurement moved into specification. Avery tightened everything carefully, then stepped back. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the machine. He had found the problem. He had created a solution, but he still didn't know whether the machine would run. Avery walked to the control panel. His hand hovered over the power button. He hesitated, then pressed it. The screen came alive. Avery waited. Nothing. Then, E4421, axis position fault. His stomach dropped. He stared at the screen. The same code, the same message, the same failure. For one horrible moment, Avery wondered whether he had been wrong. Maybe the bracket wasn't the problem. Maybe he'd wasted hours. Maybe he had damaged something. Maybe he had just destroyed the one chance he had of keeping his internship. Then Avery remembered his grandfather. Verify. He looked at the diagnostic screen again. The error was still there, but something didn't look right. The code was stored in the system from the previous shutdown. It didn't necessarily mean the fault was still active. Avery cleared the code, then initiated another start sequence. This time, the machine responded. One axis moved. Avery held his breath. A second axis moved. Then another. No strange vibration. No irregular clicking. The spindle began rotating. Slowly. Then faster. The automated test started. Avery watched the diagnostic screen. X-axis, nominal. Y-axis, nominal. Z-axis, nominal. Rotary axis, nominal. The machine continued through the sequence. Avery didn't move. Then the final message appeared. Ready for production. Avery sat down. He didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his arms. He simply stared at the machine. For 72 hours, everyone had called it dead. 12 engineers had examined it. A $94,000 replacement board had been ordered, and now the machine was running again. Not because Avery knew everything, because he noticed something everyone else had overlooked. A vibration, a measurement, a misaligned bracket, a clue, and 3 words written on an oil-stained page. Listen, feel, verify. Avery looked at his hands. They were covered in oil. His fingers were scratched. His notebook was damaged, but the machine was running. He finally allowed himself to breathe. Then he heard footsteps. It was 4:07 in the morning. Avery turned. A silver-haired man was walking toward him from the entrance of the production floor. He was 62 years old. He wore a simple jacket and carried a cup of coffee. Avery recognized him immediately. Harold Brennan, the founder. The billionaire owner of Brennan Aerospace. Harold had built the company from a small operation into a major aerospace manufacturer. And he had a strange habit. He sometimes walked through the factory late at night. No executives, no tours, no prepared presentations, just him and the operation. Harold believed you learned more about a company when nobody knew you were watching. That morning, he had heard something he hadn't expected. The $2 million CNC machine was running. Harold stopped several feet away. He looked at the machine, then Avery, then the machine again. "Who are you?" Avery stood. "Avery Fletcher. I'm an intern." Harold looked toward the control panel. "My engineers told me this machine needed a new control board." Avery nodded. "They were wrong, sir." Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then what fixed it?" Avery opened the notebook. He showed Harold the diagram, the measurements, the encoder, the mounting bracket, the scuff marks, the alignment readings, the temporary shim. Harold studied every page. Then his eyes stopped on the oil stains. "Why is this notebook covered in oil?" Avery hesitated. He didn't want to accuse Craig. He didn't want to turn the conversation into a complaint. But Harold noticed the hesitation. "Who taught you this?" Avery looked at the notebook. "My grandfather." "Was he an engineer?" "No, sir." Harold smiled. "Neither was I." Avery looked up. Harold continued. "When I started this company, I didn't know everything either. I learned to ask questions. I learned to watch people who knew things I didn't." He looked at the machine, then back at Avery. "Machines don't care about titles." Avery said nothing. "They respond to what's actually happening." Harold glanced at the clock, then pointed toward the exit. "Go home." Avery nodded. "Sleep." "Yes, sir." Harold turned away, then stopped. "Be in the conference room at 9. Avery froze. At that moment, he still had no idea what was waiting for him. But he knew one thing. That conversation wasn't over. At 9 o'clock that morning, Avery walked into the conference room. Craig Lawson was already there. So were the 12 engineers, the same people who had spent 72 hours trying to solve the problem. Avery stood near the door. He wasn't sure whether he should sit. Then the door opened. Harold Brennan walked in. The room became silent. Harold placed a folder on the table, then looked at Avery. "Come here." Avery walked forward. Harold pointed toward the whiteboard. "Show them." Avery picked up a marker. His hands were still tired. He began drawing. The encoder, the bracket, the positional data, the safety shutdown, the scuff marks, the alignment, the shim. He explained everything step by step. One engineer leaned forward. Another opened his notes. Then someone quietly said, "We never checked the bracket." Another engineer looked toward him. "We assumed the fault was electrical." Avery continued. Then he reached the final measurement. He turned toward the table, and that's when Craig noticed the notebook. Oil stains, bent corners, page 48. The same notebook he had dropped onto the machine. Craig's expression changed. Harold noticed. He looked at him. "How many hours did your team spend diagnosing this machine?" Craig answered quietly. 72. "And how much did you estimate the repair would cost?" Craig hesitated. $94,000. Harold nodded, then asked, "How much did it actually cost?" Silence. Avery finally answered, "Nothing, sir." Harold looked around the room. 12 engineers, then toward Avery. One intern. He paused. "The machine is running." Nobody spoke. Harold looked at Craig. The machine wasn't the only thing that failed. The room went completely silent. We failed to listen. Craig tried to explain. His team had followed standard procedure. They had used the manufacturer's diagnostic process. They had followed the evidence available to them. Harold listened. He didn't shout. He didn't insult anyone. Then he said, "Standard procedure should be a tool." He paused, not an excuse to stop thinking. Harold explained that the company would conduct an internal review of the diagnostic process. They would examine what had happened, and they would create a system allowing junior employees to raise technical concerns without being automatically dismissed because of their position. Craig's leadership role would be temporarily removed while the review took place. Harold looked directly at him. "Experience is valuable, Craig." A pause. "Arrogance isn't." Craig lowered his eyes. For once, he had nothing to say. Then Harold turned toward Avery, and the conversation took a completely different direction. "Avery," Harold said. "Yes, sir? How long have you been taking engineering classes?" Avery told him. Harold nodded. Then came an offer Avery never expected. A full engineering scholarship, tuition support, formal mentorship, an expanded engineering internship, and, if Avery continued developing his skills and completed the necessary qualifications, an opportunity for a full-time engineering position after graduation. Avery stood completely still. He had walked into Brennan Aerospace as an intern. Hours earlier, he had expected to lose his job. Now the billionaire owner of the company was offering to help build his future. Avery didn't know what to say. Harold simply looked at him. "You earned the opportunity." Then he added, "What you do with it is up to you." Avery nodded. He thought about the garage, the old engines, the generators, the lawnmowers, the questions, the notebook, and Earl. Everything his grandfather had taught him had suddenly become real. Later that day, Avery called his grandfather. "Grandpa!" There was a pause. "How's the machine?" Avery laughed. "It runs." Earl didn't say anything immediately. He waited. Avery told him everything. The encoder, the vibration, the bracket, the scuff marks, the oil-stained notebook, Harold finding him at 4 in the morning, and finally, the scholarship. When Avery finished, Earl asked one question. "Did you write it down?" Avery looked at the notebook. Page 48 was still stained. Several pages were damaged, but the important information remained. Every detail. Earl laughed softly. Good. That was all. He didn't need to say anything else, because the notebook had started as a simple gift from a grandfather to a curious 8-year-old boy. Now one of its pages had helped solve a problem 12 experienced engineers had missed. In the weeks that followed, the CNC machine continued operating. Production returned to schedule. The company reviewed the failure. The diagnostic process was changed. Employees were given a clearer way to report concerns. And Avery continued his education. He wasn't suddenly the smartest person in the building. He still had questions. He still made mistakes. He still had a great deal to learn. But something had changed. People listened when Avery spoke. Not because he was suddenly powerful, not because he had a better title, because they had seen what careful observation could accomplish. Craig eventually returned to a technical role after the review. His relationship with Avery changed too, but it wasn't a perfect movie ending. Craig didn't suddenly become Avery's best friend. There wasn't some dramatic apology in the hallway. Real life rarely works that way. What mattered was something bigger. The environment had changed. A young employee could raise a technical concern without automatically being dismissed. And Avery learned something just as important. He didn't always need to win an argument. Sometimes the strongest answer was simply careful work, then letting the results speak. But there was one moment Avery never forgot. It wasn't the scholarship. It wasn't meeting the billionaire. It wasn't even the moment the machine came back online. It was the moment Craig dropped his notebook into the oil. Avery remembered how small he had felt. He remembered wanting to disappear. He remembered looking at people with more education, more experience, and more authority, and wondering whether he really belonged. That moment could have become a permanent definition of him. It could have convinced him that Craig was right, that he was just an intern, that he wasn't qualified, that he didn't belong. Instead, Avery went back to what he knew. He listened, he felt, he verified, he worked, and he kept learning. Because being underestimated can hurt. Being dismissed can stay with you. but neither one has to decide what you become. 3 days earlier, Avery's badge had said, Intern, General Support. By the end of that week, the billionaire who owned Brennan Aerospace knew his name. But that wasn't Avery's greatest victory. The scholarship wasn't. The opportunity wasn't. And proving Craig Lawson wrong wasn't. His greatest victory was refusing to let someone else's opinion become his own opinion of himself. Avery didn't fix that $2 million machine because he was a genius who knew everything. He fixed it because he was willing to notice something everyone else had overlooked. He was willing to ask one more question. He was willing to verify what everyone else had already assumed. And he remembered a lesson his grandfather had given him years before. Listen, feel, verify. That lesson applies far beyond machines. Sometimes the person closest to a problem sees something the person at the top can't see. Sometimes the quiet employee has been paying attention while everyone else has been talking. And sometimes experience makes people better at solving problems. But sometimes experience can also make people too confident in the first answer they find. A title can give someone authority. A degree can give someone knowledge. Experience can give someone wisdom. But none of those things makes a person incapable of being wrong. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who has been paying the closest attention. Maybe you've experienced something like Avery's story. Maybe someone looked at your job title and decided they already knew your value. Maybe someone dismissed an idea because you were young. Maybe someone assumed they understood your abilities because of where you came from. Maybe you were told that you weren't qualified. And maybe, for a moment, you believed them. But Avery couldn't control what Craig thought about him. He couldn't control whether people respected him. He couldn't change his age. He couldn't suddenly give himself an engineering degree. What he could control was what he did next. He could keep learning. He could keep observing. He could keep improving. And when the opportunity finally came, he could be ready. That's what made the difference. Not the billionaire, not the machine, not even the scholarship. Preparation, curiosity, patience, and the refusal to stop learning simply because someone else had decided he wasn't worth listening to. The machine had been called dead, but it wasn't dead. It had been misunderstood, and perhaps people can be like that too. Sometimes someone isn't incapable. Sometimes they simply haven't been given the chance to show what they can do. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying exactly what the room needs. And sometimes the greatest mistake a person can make is deciding someone's potential based only on the position they currently occupy. Avery walked into Brennan Aerospace as an intern. He walked into that factory that night with an oil-stained notebook and no permission to touch the machine. But he walked out with something far more valuable than recognition. He walked out knowing that the lessons Avery Fletcher had given him were real. That careful observation mattered. That patience mattered, that curiosity mattered, and that being underestimated didn't mean being incapable. It simply meant someone hadn't seen the whole picture yet. So let me ask you one final question. If you were Avery, would you have gone back into that factory after Craig Lawson humiliated you? Would you have risked your internship to investigate a machine you weren't authorized to touch? Would you have kept going after the first restart failed? Or would you have walked away and let the engineers handle it? And if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, your job title, your background, or simply because someone decided you weren't important enough to listen to, tell us about it in the comments. Someone reading your story may be going through the same thing right now, because sometimes the most powerful encouragement doesn't come from a billionaire. It doesn't come from a professor. It doesn't come from a manager. Sometimes it comes from another ordinary person saying, "I've been there too." This is Story Vault. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next story. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who has been paying the closest attention.